Hi friends, Joshua Maria Garcia here, and today we're really going to be talking about the classical elements from a Greek perspective. Now, this is important to learn about because our system of zodiac signs comes from not really the Greek system, really the Babylonian system of astrology, but that has been translated to us through a very classical Greek philosophical perspective. And so understanding what the elements really mean requires understanding what the Greek philosophers meant when they were talking about elements, which is not necessarily the same thing that we mean in our New Age context when we talk about elements. And you can already spot how that's going to be different just by looking at the colors associated with the elements. We don't have our usual red, yellow, green, blue, fire, air, earth, water arrangement, and in fact they're not even in the typical arrangement that we see in Western New Age spirituality. So we're taking a step back and looking really deep into the system to see what the ancients, what our ancestors really meant by the elements, so that we can understand how they contribute those qualities to the signs. So this video is just going to be about classical elements, and then we're going to talk about the elements and the signs in the next one. If you're really interested in learning more about the Greek system and and especially about Greek medicine or humoral medicine, which is the basis for practices like Chinese traditional medicine or Ayurveda or Unani Tib, then this is a great place to start doing that learning and get an introduction to the basics. And it's called GreekMedicine.net, and it's made by David Osborne, and it's excellent. It's really thorough. I go back to it all the time, even though I'm in clinical practice with humoral medicine, but it's just such a great resource when you need to go back and make sure you understand something about the system, even if you're working in it professionally. Okay, so I really recommend that website for learning more. I'm just going to give you a real quick and dirty introduction to the system. Now, when we're talking about the classical system of the elements, what we're really talking about is modulation of energy. And this is broken down into several binaries that recombine to create the elements themselves. So our goal is to get down to this level here where we actually see the elements, but we need to start up here with energy, which is the root of all of this complication that you see before you. Now, energy, there's either a lot of it or not a lot of it, and it's a spectrum, but at the extremes, a lot of energy gives us hot, and not a lot of energy gives us cold. So we have one binary or polarity of a lot of energy, not a lot of energy, hot and cold. That's pretty easy to understand. But what do we actually mean by hot and cold? Because those are going to bring up some associations for you that might not fit into what we're actually describing here all the time. It's good to use those metaphors when you are doing a chart interpretation, because that's how you're going to interact with the chart and how new meaning is going to come out of the chart. But when we're learning a system, we want to be really clear about what we're talking about. So we need to keep going back to hot is more energy, cold is less energy. And that's going to show us what we really mean by what element the sign is. Now, if you do have a lot of cold, which is also the same thing as not a lot of hot or not a lot of energy, then you're going to tend to condense moisture. And so a secondary quality that we have, a secondary expression of energy that we have, is moisture. And yes, that's a secondary expression of energy. It is closer to matter, it is closer to form to be talking about moisture. But when we're talking about moisture in the elements, we're not actually talking about physical water, right? That comes later. We're talking about the energy of moisture itself, which has to do with substance, complication, memory, reflection, storage. Like, that's what moisture really has to do with. So in the second polarity, we have moisture, and when there's not a lot of moisture, now we're moving in the opposite direction, you have dryness, right? That's dry because it doesn't have moisture. So in the primary polarity, we start with hot and move to cold. In the secondary polarity, we start with moisture and move to dry. Now, think about what dry means. Dry means not having a lot of complication. Dry means straightforward. Dry means not remembering necessarily. This is a different kind of energy that we're talking about, not physical dryness exactly. So these qualities, I should say, are going to recombine into what we think of as elements. So if you have hot and dry, you get fire. But if you add moisture into the mix, you get air. And so in some ways, fire is more primary, right? It's more this idea of heat itself, because heat is naturally dry. But when you mix in the moisture that comes from that other side of the polarity, you get a slight modulation of that energy, and that's where you get air. Now, coming from the other direction, we have cold and wet, which is very much primary cold, that is water. And when you mix in dryness or really evaporate off the moisture, you get earth. And so this is also, I mean, I use the term polarity very intentionally. We've already learned in Fundamentals of Natal Astrology about polarity, about positive and negative. So this is very much positive and negative in a much more complicated expression. Positive is hot, negative is cold. Secondary positivity is dry. Secondary negativity is wet. And so we can also say that fire is primarily positive and secondarily negative. Sorry, that's wrong. That would be wrong. You could say that, but it would be wrong. Fire is positive both primarily and secondarily. Oh my gosh. You always need to let your coffee kick in before you make a video. Okay, but when we have primary negativity and secondary negativity, we get water. When you get an admixture, when you change the secondary polarity, you get those secondary elements, air and earth. So the elements of the signs are going to actually reflect these qualities of hot, cold, dry, and wet. Now, before we go into that, I just want to point out that in the Greek system, the point of getting to this is that these elements actually surface in the body as humors or vapors, energies in the body that, when balanced, produce health, create health in the organism. And when they're out of balance, we see disease along the lines of whatever is in excess or deficiency. So that's a really fancy way of saying that balance of the whole person is what makes health, and imbalance of the person is what makes illness. And that's a huge oversimplification of a vastly complex system. But basically, these elements produce, or they surface, we should say, in the body as yellow bile or choler, blood, black bile or melancholy, and phlegm. And in the Greek system, all of these are components of what we call blood. So the red humor there is really hemoglobin specifically, not just the blood in general. But they're also present in the body in other places. Like, for example, we would say that melancholy is present in the bones because they're the coldest, driest organ in the body. Bones are organs, y'all. They're not just, they don't just sit there. They're dynamic. They have circulation, they grow, and then they don't grow anymore, and then they deteriorate. So this is basically how in the Greek system we see those elements surface in the body is through the humors, which is why we call those systems of medicine related to this system humoral medicine, as a sort of catch-all for all of them. But we're in astrology going to focus primarily on this level here. What you need to know is that those elements go back to cold and wet, go back to hot and dry qualities within the elements when we're thinking of the signs. So we're going to see how that plays out in the next video.